Grade school? Are you guys there? What's going on? What's my feed like right now? Is it the right feed? It's the right feed. You can hopefully hear me. The same things that I get anxiety about right before I press that start streaming button every Friday morning seem to once again be working. So I must be living right. Hey guys, what's going on? Happy Friday. Happy grade school. Thanks for joining me for an early edition of grade school. By the way, a quick announcement. I moved grade school this morning because I'm going to be teaching a webinar for Blackmagic Design at our normal grade school time on DCTL creation. That webinar is 100% free. And if you're not sick of me after this hour and you're interested in DCTLs, come join me for that thing. We're going to go from 10 a.m. to noon Pacific. And if you've never touched a DCTL or coded one before, but you're interested, you will have coded your first DCTL by the time we are done with that session. So come check it out if you're interested. It's totally free. Rafa, I meant to ask you before we got started, and good morning to you, Rafa, first of all.
Hello, good morning.
By the way, everyone, I'm for the second week in a row having audio issues. So Rafa, if you can't hear him just from my mic picking up his voice on my speakers, Rafa very enthusiastically says good morning, and I'm sure is thrilled to be here for grade school as always. Rafa, what I was going to say is maybe from our events page, you could copy and paste the registration link for the DCTL creation course for anyone who's interested in signing up for after this.
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
Give me a minute and I'll do it.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so that's the thing, guys. And what else? I'm going to make a quick change over here in my Resolve world. What's going on with you guys? How's your week been? I've had a pretty good week. My color grading business has been unusually busy this summer. So I think I mentioned this last week, but struggling to keep up with all the work and also at the same time build systems as we go so that we can continue to scale and do awesome work and then also do grade school and all the other fun stuff that I do in addition to my actual color grading business. So hope you guys are having a great summer as well. I can't believe it's September already. It's been a crazy year to say the least. That's everything that's going on in my world. We're going to talk about some ACES today. It's been a while since we talked about ACES, and it seems like there's already a lot of energy and excitement and good questions about ACES, so I'm looking forward to diving into it with you today. Before we do, the only other announcement I want to share with you guys, we have opened the waitlist for my Colorist Career Accelerator that is happening in October. This is our second run after we launched the first run of it in June. And boy, was it awesome. It was a really good time. It's a course that I've been dreaming about putting together for as long as I've been a colorist. It's indeed a course that I wished that I'd had in the earlier parts of my career that essentially is aimed at equipping you with the tools, the knowledge, and the craft to really, really build or grow a excellent world-class color grading business. So if that's you, if you're interested in that, if you are a professional in another sphere, you want to make the transition over to professional color grading, maybe you're relatively new to color grading or you're really passionate about it, but it's not yet your livelihood and you want to make that transition, you are the one who I've designed the Colorist Career Accelerator for. It's 4 days of nonstop discussion of everything that you need to build a business. So we're going to talk about craft. We're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of like, how do you do an estimate? How do you negotiate price? How do you make sure that you get paid? Sort of an expansion on some of the business practices grade school episodes that we've done in the past, and really try to wrap all of it in a package that allows you to go out and really feel great about your value offering, and in return to be able to get great value back for your color grading business. So if you're interested in that, go sign up for that waitlist. It's totally obligation free. You don't have to commit to anything by signing up for it. However, the last run of the course with our registration cap, which we put on in order to keep the value high for every participant, with that registration cap, we sold out in less than 24 hours, and 91% of those seats went to people on the waitlist. So if you are interested, get on the waitlist because it's going to give you a 91% chance of actually being able to get a spot if you want it. And conversely, of course, if you don't, then you stand a very slim chance of actually being able to secure a seat. So go sign up for that. That's all I've got to announce for you guys this morning. Let's talk about ACES. I usually like to rant for a minute at the beginning of grade school, but I have a feeling that we've got an active chat full of questions already, Rafa. Is my spidey sense correct on this?
Can you repeat the question, please?
Do we already have quite a few questions about ACES, or should I talk about some introductory ideas first?
I say go on first.
Okay. Okay, good. I'm going to let you guys build up your questions. So we did a good sort of initial tour this week in our pre-recorded video on the ACES pipeline and specifically what has changed in ACES 1.3. So I'm going to flip over to my resolve here and just sort of recap that workflow that we built out. So I'm going to go to my project settings. I'm going to go to my color management. I'm going to go kind of fast on this because if you haven't watched that video yet, or if I'm going too fast for you today, you can go back and check out that video from this week. For my color science, I'm going to go to ACES CCT. And for my input transform, I'm going to say Arilog C3 because that's a good chunk of my material. Output transform is going to be Rec 709. And I'm going to flip my ACES version, not to any of these, but to ACES 1.3. And you'll see a small change here in the UI in the project settings when I do that. I've got this little apply ACES reference gamut compress thing turned on, which was really the focus of our pre-recorded video this week of the introduction of this gamut compression scheme to deal essentially with professional and prosumer cameras that may have a gamut that is actually larger than the working gamut spec'd by the ACES standard. When that happens, you can get something that we've probably all seen before. I'm going to turn this off just to give us a quick demo. You can get something like I'm looking at on this image where I'm like, okay, well, this is now managed, but I've got this like crazy cyan tearing going on up here. And as we looked at in the video, if I apply this reference gamut compression, that flips back off. So that was really the big change that came about in ACES 1.3. And as I sort of teed up in the video this week, I am even more excited about ACES 2.0. There's a bunch of stuff that's going to change in ACES 2.0, and I'm not an expert on every single change that we can expect to see there. But the big one that I know we can expect is there's been a lot of discussion and talk of revision of the actual output transform, of the way that the image is getting out to the display. And that's something that you guys have heard me talk about before. And, to kind of go back and do a very brief history lesson, this current ACES RRT, if you want to call it that, I think that term has even been deprecated, but the rendering intent, the display transform, the way that we take our 10 pounds of dirt and put it into a 5-pound sack, to use my favorite analogy, or the way that we take our big wide gamut high dynamic range working space and compress it into the working space and dynamic range of our Rec 709 or even our HDR display. That's what I'm talking about. That scheme that's currently used by ACES. That scheme can actually produce really good results. So like, I don't even have a look. Am I lying about that? Yeah, let me turn my look off here in this project. Oh, that's interesting. It's not even doing anything anyway. Good. So that scheme can produce good results kind of out of the box. Like the ACES, the beef, but also I think something that people like about it is it kind of has a feel. It has a vibe. It has a look. It has some heavier contrast. Feels more filmic than you might get with another color management framework. And we've done comparisons in the past where I could do a color management pipeline from Arilog C out to Rec 709 like I'm doing here via ACES versus via Resolve Color Management. I'm in general going to have a less contrasty, less sort of finished image when I'm working in something like Resolve Color Management. So that's sometimes a beef and sometimes like an accolade that is cast at the feet of ACES is we say like, well, there's already kind of a look in there, right? That can be good or bad depending on whether you would like to spin up your own look inside of that pipeline. And just to go even further back into history just for a moment, the reason why we see this, the reason why we see this contrastier image with more sort of aggressive compression of highlights and shadows than we would typically see with a camera manufacturer's LUT or with another color management framework is because ACES was developed at a time when colorists, digital intermediate artists, were used to doing their grading under film print emulation LUTs. Now, at the time, this wasn't like, oh, everybody just thinks those are cool. Everybody graded under film print emulation LUTs because digital intermediate artists at the time, colorists, were true digital intermediate artists, and they were actually going to be printing their work back out onto a film print. So the film print LUT they were grading under was simply a way of seeing what was going to happen when they printed their grade onto a particular film stock. So that was where all of these artists were coming from. And so when ACES was developing their color management framework for a variety of cameras, they were trying to sort of meet those artists where they were and give them a film print-like level of contrast and compression. And that's really where the legacy character of greater compression, greater contrast comes from in the ACES system. And it's something that we've been talking about ever since and saying, gosh, is that really desirable? Is that really right to do a sort of film print emulation or a faux film print emulation right within the technical transforms of the system? Many people have said, no, probably not. And I agree with that. So all a very long way of saying that stuff is being fundamentally rethought and reimagined in ACES 2.0. And if we have time today, I can even show you some of the ACES 2.0, what they're calling candidate transforms. They're actually out there, publicly available for us to download and test and see which ones we like better. And I think that's a fascinating exercise for any of us who are a bit more inclined toward geekery. But we can take a look at those and see that they are indeed sort of reworked from the ground up to give a different result. And unlike the ACES 0.x and 1.x output transforms, this ACES 2.0 transform, regardless of which of the candidates gets selected, is really not derived or based on a sort of film print emulation of any sort, unlike the ACES output transform that we've been living with for version 0.x and 1.x, which actually was designed by Fujifilm to get a response similar to the contrast character of their print stocks. So some of the stuff we can look forward to in ACES 2.0 there, some of the reason why we see this more contrasty rendering in the current version of ACES. And again, I think there's pros and cons to that, but it's something that's going to change in ACES 2.0, and I think for the better, for my personal taste. How are we doing out there, Rafa? Any questions so far?
Yeah, we have a lot of them.
Okay.
Let's start by this one. Do you think ACES 2.0 will make you jump ship from DaVinci White gamut?
Yeah, so that's kind of the $1 million question. I hope to show you guys some of the things that are, and I'm sorry guys, as I mentioned at the beginning of class, you probably are not going to be able to hear Rafa very well, so I will do my best to remember to repeat his questions. The question is, when ACES 2.0 releases, do you, Cullen, think that you will potentially pivot from using DaVinci Wide Gamut, as we've been talking about so much this year, or will you remain with DaVinci Wide Gamut? So my answer to that is that there are a bunch of things that I really like about the ACES 2.0 system, and specifically the candidate transforms that I'll show you at some point today. The thing that I am most frustrated by with ACES 2.0 is the spec, the actual color space, the working space. ACES CCT will not be changing. It will still be ACES CCT. And this connects up to the conversation we had this week about gamut compression. So again, if I just, like flip this off like so and look at this nasty cyan tearing business that I have up here, and then I flip this on, if you watched this week's video and you followed along with it and you maybe had an image that you were able to get that misbehavior out of and then see the fix from the gamut compression, this is a very, very elegant solution, really, really well implemented by the subcommittee, the virtual working group that worked on this problem. However, it is a solution to a problem that should not exist. There's no reason that a working gamut should be smaller than any camera gamut. And that is the reality with the AP1 primary set. So some of you guys have heard me talk about this before. My pitch for a while has been just do away with AP1. I don't personally see why it's necessary. And as always, I'll throw out the disclaimer, ACES team, if any of you guys are listening and I'm totally missing something, then I would be happy to be corrected. But to my thinking, I can't see a reason for AP1. It's just a small gamut that is smaller than many camera gamuts today that was devised in a different time that we could probably just do away with. So will I adopt ACES? Maybe, and it sort of depends on how you define adopting ACES. The output transforms, yes. Will I ever work in AP1 again? Probably not. So to the extent that that is synonymous with working in ACES, I for as long as AP1 is the gamut of the ACES CCT or of the ACES working color grading space, I won't be switching over back to vanilla ACES. However, I will continue to be interested in the project and pick the pieces that I like. And your answer may be different to that. It just depends on what you're doing. For me, I prefer an ideal solution that doesn't have any solutions or compensations that are built in there, however well devised they may be.
All right. Can you go over the node-based color management for 1.3, if anything has changed?
Sure, absolutely. So the question is, can we go over node-based ACES color management within 1.3? So all that we're asking there is like, hey, instead of doing our color management here in our project settings, can we do it in nodes? And this is actually the way that I show you how to do it in the ACES Explained series that we did last year, which, by the way, if you want to get a really thorough, sort of like ground knowledge of ACES, that's still a great series to go through. Very little has actually changed except for the things that I highlighted in last week's video. The core concepts and ideas are going to be identical. So that's still a valuable series to work your way through if you'd like to go deeper with ACES. But for now, I'm going to flip back over to DaVinci Wire GB. And just before I move off of here, I'm just going to go ahead and tell Resolve what my timeline color space and what my output color space are, because that's going to be helpful with tagging and with my HDR tools and things like that. Even though that's not going to change my image directly, it will change the behavior of some tools and it will change the tags in my rendered image. Okay, so I'm going to hit save. And now I'm back to a boring log set of images. And all I'm going to do here is let's just create a group. I'm going to grab everything and go over to my clip level. And we're going to say add into a new group. Let's call this, not ACES, call it ARI. Oh, I've already got a group called ARI. Let's call it ARI 2. So within ARI 2, I'm going to do my color management using groups, group pre-clips and post-clips. You don't have to do this. I just like to do this personally because it allows me to color manage in nodes, which actually is my personal preference. It's the way that I work. But I can do it this way. When I do it this way, my nodes are nearby, but kind of out of sight because for the most part, I'm not really going to look at them once I set them up. So let's get the first link in the chain. Let's get our IDT. Here's our ACES transform that I'm going to drop onto node 1 in my group pre-clip. This is the very first thing that hits the image before anything else happens. Input transform is going to be ARI log C3. We have to be mindful now of ARI log C3 versus log C4 with the release of the new Alexa 35. All of this material is ARI log C3, so that's what I'm going to select here. And then for my output transform, I'm going to select CSC ACES CCT. This is one of the smaller changes, or excuse me, CCT, ACES CCT CSC. One of the smaller changes here is that some of these actual menu items have moved around in ACES 1.3. This used to be at the very top. I liked it better when it was at the very top, but what do I know? I just work here. It's down here like halfway down the menu, so if you can't find it, that's why. So that's my input. I've now gone from ARI log C3 into ACES CCT. I'm going to label that in. And then here at either the group post clip level or at the timeline level, I'm going to do another ACES transform. And we're going to go from ACES CCT, which again is living in that sort of non-intuitive new location. And we're going to go out to Rec 7 or 9. And we'll call this out. So really not much has changed from ACES 1.2. The main thing to note is if we want to get that same gamut compression behavior that we were getting in our project settings, where that needs to happen is right here in the journey from ARI log C3 to ACES CCT. Let's just run an experiment. To be honest, I haven't actually checked this. Would it work if I did it here? Okay. It does work if I do it there. It's better to do it, essentially that just means that you have invalid ACES CCT values until you get to your output transform. It's better to sanitize or to scale or to compress your out of gamut values here at the input stage, in my opinion. So we're going to do ACES reference gamut compress, like so. So that's how I would set up that exact same pipeline using nodes as opposed to project settings. Pros and cons to both. For what it's worth, this is how I do my actual projects, just because I like, if I want to, being able to look at every single node that is affecting the color management journey of my image and being able to turn it off and on and alter it and tweak it. I just feel like I've got a little more visibility and a little bit more control working in that way.
Okay, a question from Chelsea Fernandez. When establishing the color management on the project level with ACES, is there a way to not affect the offline reference video when conforming?
Oh, this is a cool question. So if I'm understanding it, the question is when we are setting up color management using using nodes, right, Raphael?
No, the project level.
Oh, at the project level.
Yeah.
Okay, gotcha. So when we are setting up ACES at the project level, is there a way to avoid our offline reference clip getting color managed? This is actually a fun thing to experiment with. I don't know, but I think we should find out, don't y'all? So I'll demonstrate, hopefully demonstrate the problem, and then we can demonstrate the solution. So let's just find any old clip that doesn't even have to be. Let me wipe that out. It can really be truly any old clip. So I'm going to reveal this clip in my media storage, and I'm going to add it as an offline reference clip, like so. And now, by the way, this is the workflow if you want to add offline reference clips from editorial. This is the way to do it. So I've just added that as an offline reference clip, and that's indicated by that checkerboard icon here in my master level. And now I'm simply going to go to timeline 1, which is what I'm working in, and say timelines, link offline reference clip. I've only got one option because I've only got one offline reference clip that I've imported. And now when I wipe to that, this is a good tweak as well. I think probably what we're seeing is that this original clip, it started at hour 23. 23:02, 23:09. So really what I need to do is have my timeline start at that same point. This is not something you would normally need to do with an actual offline reference clip, but you may need to change your start time code to 0 instead of 1 hour, depending on the offline reference that you've received. But once I do this, and I go to my, let's actually move everything down. And now when I go to this, I'm seeing this as my offline reference clip. And the question is, can I avoid color management of this offline reference? I actually don't know, but I'm very curious to see. What it looks like I can do is within my project settings, if I go to my ACES input transform, I can, for starters, just turn it off and say no input transform. And that's getting me closer, but I don't believe that's actually the raw log yet. Let's just compare. No, that may indeed be the raw log, although maybe I'm seeing the color managed version even here in the viewer. Let's see if there's like a bypass option. I mean, that's a good start. Can I actually bypass color management altogether? Maybe not. Or this is another option I could do, is if I really want to do nothing, I could invert apparently the Rec 7 or 9 display that's coming ultimately down the line. Yeah, I might have to research that one for you. I think the closest so far was changing that ACES input transform, but interestingly, unlike with, say, a clip like this, where I can right-click and say bypass color management, it does appear that there's no way to just bypass the color management entirely. I think what I'm seeing here is still some level of color management. Let's actually just check that right now. Maybe I'm solving it and I'm not giving myself enough credit. Let's turn our color science off of ACES CCT completely and see if this side of the image actually changes. Okay, it does. All right, so for our next trick, let's try this. So right now we're looking at a totally unmanaged offline reference clip. We've got the goal achieved. This is an odd example because I don't have any handy materials that would demo out probably a more realistic set of circumstances for the question you're asking. However, if we look at this and we say, okay, this is the goal. I want the image to look like this when I turn on my project level ACES color management. Let's try something out here. I'm going to go back and turn on my ACES CCT. This is all correct. And now I'm going to do what I had the hunch to do earlier, which is to do a display inversion, a Rec 7 or 9 display inversion. So I'm right-clicking, ACES input transform, invert display, Rec 7 or 9, because that's where I'm going. So I'm basically nulling the display transform that's going to happen after the fact, because if you have an invert followed by a forward, you end up with nothing, right? So if my thinking is correct, if my hunch is correct, when I turn my color science back to DaVinci YRGB, I should see no change right here whatsoever. Okay, we solved it. We did a thing. So that would be your move there. When you're doing ACES at your project level color management, assuming you are targeting Rec 7 or 9, right-click that offline reference clip, go to ACES Input Transform, and select the Invert Display submenu, and then select the standard that you are targeting with your project settings for your output transform. That was kind of a fun exploration. Great question.
All right, another question from Chelsea. When approaching ACES 1.3 in a node-based setting, what is the difference between reference gamut compress versus parametric gamut compress?
Oh, great question. So we want to look at, if we go back to doing like a node-based type of ACES color management. So let's turn this back off for the moment and just flip these things back to where I wanted to see them. So we're back to doing node-based color management. And the question is, here at the input stage, when I'm using my gamut compression, what's the difference between this and the parametric gamut compress? So here's a fun thing that might not sound like that big of a deal to you guys, but was like a really fun light bulb for me for whatever reason. The day that I figured that parametric is usually just being used to refer to parameters. So if I tell you that this is a parametric gamut compress, that just means that there are parameters that will be exposed to me. Right now, the reference gamut compress, there's all kinds of math happening under the hood and variables and things that are being sort of arbitrarily defined. But if we go to the parametric version, we will actually be given parameters that allow us to control that. So when I turn that on, you can see those parameters being revealed. Right now, these are the exact positions of these parameters in the reference gamut compress. Here in the parametric, they are explicitly revealed to us. Now, this is kind of a fun thing that I'll walk you guys through. These controls, I will be the first to admit, are not the most intuitive, especially because for me, like, I understand everything by visuals, by curves, and there's no visualization of what these compression curves are actually doing. So here's what I like to do. Before ACES 1.3 released, there was a GitHub repository that I believe is still active with the exact gamut compression algorithm that was used, ended up being implemented in ACES 1.3. So let me just look through my goodies here. This is a slightly customized version that I built. But if we just, sort of lab this out, I'm going to go to one of these problem images. I'm going to turn my gamut compression off completely. So I've got that nasty tearing. I'm now going to go over to my gamut compressor with my working space set to ACCCT and turn it on. So I've got that same result. Right now, all I've managed to do is what I could have gotten with a single menu click here. It just happens to be in a separate explicit DCTL. But here's what I like. This thing right here. I didn't invent this. This was part of that DCTL. It allows you to actually visualize the way that values are being compressed into the gamut. So to go back to the original question, what does the parametric gamut compression scheme mean? Well, it allows us to establish a couple of things. It allows us to establish essentially how far, it's two variables. How far above the limit do you want me to reach for out of gamut values? So if 0 to 1 are valid values and anything above 1 or below 0 is not a valid value, these sliders are determining, well, how far should I look? How out of gamut will the out of gamut values be? Because if I can expect to find values, 0.5, at like values of like 1.5, I'm going to need to be more aggressive with my compression than if the highest value that's out of gamut is really only ever going to get to like around 1.1 or so. So that's what this setting is all about, is like, how far do you want me to reach outside of the acceptable range to look for out of gamut values? And then this threshold, this is simply defining how far into the original core of the image should I be allowing the curve to extend. So you can see the lower I put this threshold, the more gradual the curve, but also if the original was a straight line here, the more saturation I'm losing even for values that are in gamut. So that's a little bit of background. I'll see if I can dig up the link for you guys for this gamut compression DCTL. I think we've shared it before, but it's out there, I believe, still publicly available. And really all it's going to do is give you the opportunity to see an overlay visual for what would otherwise just be a blind set of parameters here in the ACES input transform. But it's kind of fun to play around with. Honestly, I think one of the successes of this gamut compression algorithm is I don't see much need for it to change. I don't think that's something you would really need to tune much. Certainly not on an individual basis, maybe more like at a project or a like camera level. But I think it looks pretty good even without doing that. So you may or may not need to use it, but that's what those parameters are. And if you grab this DCTL from, I believe it's Jed Smith's GitHub, or maybe it's Nick Shaw's, I can't remember, two of the many smart people who are involved in the working group for this gamut compression solution. It's on one of their GitHubs, and if you do download this, then you get that handy dandy inversion feature as well. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, a question from Kaur Hendrickson. How will you use ACES CCT gamma with AP0 in a node-based setup, as the ACES transform doesn't seem to allow for that?
Yes, great question. So the question is, how would we use basically what I've been proposing, the ACES AP0 gamut or primary set with an ACES CCT curve within ACES? How would we pull that off? So there's lots of different ways that we could go about it, but the observation is correct that there doesn't seem to be a way to do that within just ACES transforms. So I would do something like this. Let's say I'm going to build that pipeline right now using ACES 1.3. We're going to do it in nodes, and we're going to start by setting up our IDT a bit differently. Instead of going into ACES CCT, which is where that sort of constriction of color gamut takes place, I'm going to go into ACES. Now, I wish we didn't have so much lag here on YouTube Live, because I'd love to wait to get everyone's answer, but answer to yourself, answer in your own mind. What is the label for if I want to go from array log C3 to ACES AP0 linear? What does the menu item for that look like here in my output transform? Because as we talked about in this week's pre-recorded video, it's not what it used to be. There used to be a big thing here at the very top that said ACES, and that's how I knew I was transforming into ACES. That setting doesn't exist. I'm not going to thumb through this entire menu, but you can take my word for it. There is no menu item that says ACES. If you look at all the other ACES flavors here, it's conspicuously missing. So how do I actually do that? How do I get to ACES AP0 linear? Well, if you've had enough time to think about it, the way we do it is we say no output transform, which once you see what they mean, it's like, okay, that actually makes perfect sense. But I definitely cried foul when ACES 1.3 came out. I was like, ACES 1.3 is broken. There's not even an ACES input or output transform. What the hell? It's there. It's just called no output transform now. So this is how I would start. From here, I'm happy with my primary set. I'm glad I'm in ACES AP0, right? The only thing that I want to change is I want to get into ACES CCT. I want to work in a log curve, not in a linear curve. So I'm going to use a color space transform for that, since ACES doesn't allow us to explicitly do separate color space and gammas. And for my color space transform, I'm going to say ACES AP0 to ACES AP0. Don't do anything different. Linear input gamma, ACES CCT, and don't do any of this fun stuff. Okay? So that's going to be, and I would label this as I go along, something like so. So we're a little more than halfway there now. We are now in my, AP0 ACES CCT working space that I keep proposing as being the best solution. And now if we go over here to where the output side is happening, we need to do something a little bit different here, right? Because this transform is not correct. It's expecting an AP1 gamut and the ACES CCT curve, and we are feeding it the AP0 gamut, that larger gamut, and the ACES CCT curve. So we need to change its expectation over here, right? All I'm going to do here is tell it, hey, go from big ACES. This, on this case, would be no input transform, right? Out to Rec 709. Now you can answer to yourself, what do I need to do immediately to the left of this node in order to complete this pipeline? Is anyone's brain hurting yet? If so, that's okay. This is a little complex. This is why I wish there was an option. You can call it whatever you want. You can call it, ACES CCT, Super ACES CCT or ACES CCT 0, whatever you want to sort of style it as. But I would definitely not be mad at having the 4 links in the chain that we're building right now condensed down into 2. Think about it to yourself. What am I going to do right here in order to complete this pipeline and make it valid? I'm going to do the opposite of what we did with our other color space transform, right? Still an ACES AP0. That's never going to change. That is my working gamut, ACES AP0. That's what I teed in with. That's what I mapped in with. That's what I'm mapping out with. That's never going to change. All I'm going to do here now is the opposite of what I did before. We're going to go from ACES CCT back to linear, like so. And now we've got this nice big, fully built out pipeline. Now, this is actually a fun thing that we discovered, I think, here in grade school, maybe a month or so ago. It turns out that the Array Wide Gamut 3 spec is actually still larger than ACES AP0. So we're actually still getting this issue in here. Now, why is that not a problem? Why is that okay compared to when I get this exact same issue and I complain about it in AP1? Well, it's kind of a complex answer, but to put it simply, has everybody seen the CIE horseshoe before? It's that big horseshoe shape that is supposed to represent all the colors that humans can see. You've seen that, right? So we use that horseshoe as our baseline, and then we'll draw a triangle in there and say, hey, this represents Rec 709. And if it's outside of the triangle drawn by these 3 points, it's outside of the Rec 709 gamut. We'll do the same thing with AP1 or any other triangle that we might draw, any 3 points. In the same way that a point outside of that triangle is out of that gamut, and the device that has that gamut either cannot capture or cannot reproduce that color that is outside of that triangle. In the same way, if you visualize that horseshoe, right, you have a value that is outside of that horseshoe, which is totally that's most values on the electromagnetic spectrum. Most energy on the electromagnetic spectrum falls outside the range of visible light. Visible light is a very narrow band of the electromagnetic spectrum, which we perceive as light or as color. And if you want a primer on all this stuff or to brush up on it, you can check out the ACES Explained series, where I actually go into a little bit more depth on these things in the very first series with some visuals to help you out in case me barking at you is not sufficient to grasp what the hell I'm talking about. At any rate, in the same way that a value outside of, say, a Rec 709 triangle drawn within a CIE horseshoe is a value that that device can't capture or reproduce, a value outside of the CIE horseshoe, we can't see it, okay? The only values that are not being properly mapped in this environment right now into ACES AP0 from Array Log C3 are values that are outside of, that's the fancy term is the spectral locus, values that are outside of that horseshoe. So you have to ask, if it's not possible to see that color, what are we really losing by losing it? And in fact, if you look at the new Array Log C4 standard, they have somewhat constrained that gamut so that its triangle does not have as many values that are outside of the CIE horseshoe. So that's kind of a geeky explanation of why, in my opinion, it's okay that we're seeing that tearing here as opposed to when we see it in AP1, because when we see it in AP1, it's due to the fact that we have a gamut that is really kind of closest to Rec 2020, but there's all kinds of totally valid horseshoe values that the AP1 triangle does not enclose. So we don't want to lose those values. Those values, if the camera shot them, I want them. I want to work with them, and I want to figure out how I'm going to map them down into my display. I don't want to truncate them preemptively. But if it's a value that's outside of the spectral locus completely, I don't see a reason to retain them, because one way or the other, they will never be seen, right? And to say, oh, I'm going to compress them back into space or do something fancy, my question would be, why? Take the image as far as your vision would take it and then let it clip off at that point. So That's not to say we don't want to deal with this, but that's I just want to emphasize, like, I've been making this whole pitch for AP0 ACES CCT as a way of getting around the gamut issues of AP1. And yet when I demo this for you, we are seeing a gamut issue. That's an artifact of the camera gamut, which has indeed been constrained to a more sensible scope for Arri log C4 and has eliminated what Arri calls virtual colors, literally colors that don't have any meaning to the human eye. And at any rate, once we are here, we have a very easy task. I'll show you another fun trick that we could tack on top of this if I was actually building this pipeline for real. I'm just going to copy my ACES transform and paste it downstream of my conversion to CCT, or even better yet, I'm going to do it upstream. So I'm going to do it right here. Let's see, do I even need to get that fancy? No, we can just gamut compress right here. The other fun thing about this gamut compression is it's going to compress to the gamut that I'm specifying here. So if I specify AP0, we're going to compress only to AP0 and not choke it down into AP1, which again is my whole beef. I'm not mad. You can compress things or clip things or do whatever you want to make them fit into AP0. I'm good with that because AP0 completely encircles the CAE horseshoe. That's indeed how it was devised. That's why the points on the AP0 primary set were defined as they are, because they are the points that enclose, they're the perfect points to enclose, the perfect 3 points, I should say, to enclose the horseshoe with a minimum of virtual colors, but that does cover all the colors inside of the horseshoe. Okay, that's a long explanation, but that's how I would use AP0 ACES CCT in an actual production context. Log C3 to ACES, linear to ACES CCT, and then you do the opposite, ACES CCT to linear, and then ACES out to Rec 709.
Okay, a question from Easy Sonka. Rec 709 material, is there an approach to process them in ACES? And I want to add to the question just to spice it up a little bit. Most of the time we have to go beyond 100 nits in the IDT using color space transforms in resolve color management to avoid artifacting and have proper controls using tools like the color wheels. But since in ACES we don't have those tone mapping options, can you explain how ACES handles that transformation?
Yes, I can. So we just had a really good two-part question that not everyone is probably able to hear. I'll just briefly summarize it. So the first question is, like, what are kind of our best practices for IDTing, input mapping Rec 709 material into ACES? And then Rafa had the very good question that he's adding to that of asking, excuse me, of asking, when we have a Rec 709 source whose value is greater than 100 nits, which is a good chunk of the time, how do we deal with that in ACES? Because when we're doing resolve color management, we can actually specify, hey, reach higher into this source to get the nits above 100, whereas with an ACES transform, we don't have that option. So let's just put some form to these ideas real fast here. I'm going to do away with my precious AP0 ACES CCT model, which maybe the ACES committee will watch this and go, wow, that's what we never thought of. Or maybe they've already thought of it and they've got good reason not to do it. What do I know? For now, we're going to go back to our sort of vanilla pipeline that we built here. Okay, so we're just going log C3 into ACES CCT, like so, reference gamut compress, and then we're going out to 709 with the appropriate transform. So the question is, like, what if we had a Rec 709 source here? And I'm trying to think of the best way to demo this. Hang tight 1 second. I'm going to go rooting around in my private stash. I want to make sure I'm not revealing anything that I shouldn't. But I've got some Rec 709 material that we can look at. Some Rec 709 material that does indeed reach way past 100 nits. Okay, so I'm going to cut this in and then I will put my thing back on. All right, so I've just added a new image to my timeline that looks zany right now. because I'm not color managing it, right? So the first thing I need to do is figure out some way to tell ACES, to tell my ACES pipeline how exactly what exactly this image is. Because right now I'm saying ACES CCT, but the front end of that journey hasn't been teed up for this image, right? I know I want to go to ACES CCT, and I know that I'm not in ACES CCT right now. So I'm going to say Rec 709. Let's just see what that gets us. Okay, so that's actually okay, but we've got, like, if I look at the original image, well, that's actually sort of more than okay. I was thinking this image would be a pretty good example of the limitation of the ACES Rec 709 input transform, but it's not as dramatic as I wanted. However, we can still look at the concepts here. So what I want to do now is talk about if I wanted to have a little more control over sculpting this signal on the input side. I actually can use a variation on a technique that I was just using. There's no reason we can't use color space transforms to get in and out of ACES. That's totally okay. There's a bit of a sense with ACES, or at least I know there was for me, of like, oh, it's special, it's magic, and it doesn't use the same color science that something like a color space transform would. But that's not true. It's just using tone curves and matrices. So there's no reason we can't do this if we need the control. So I'm just going to set up some parameters here, okay? Now, what I want to do, this goes back to Rafa's part of the question, is I'm going to set up some luminance mapping so that I can control the way the dynamic range of my lower dynamic range master is being sort of moved into this larger dynamic range. I can control how much of that dynamic range I want it to occupy, how much of my working ACES CCT dynamic range I want the image to fill. And I can also control how much dynamic range I account for on the input side. Does that make sense? It's a little slippery, but it's two variables. What am I telling the color space transform to look for in terms of source dynamic range before it goes, oh, well, there's nothing above 100 nits, so I'm not even going to look for values. That's what's happening right now. And then once I have that base assumption, how far am I telling it to stretch or expand the dynamic range into the dynamic range of my ACES CCT working space? Okay. So a sensible baseline might be to say, well, I want all the dynamic range I can get. So I'm going to go full 10K here, and then I'm going to work my max input. And this is something that you can absolutely use your waveform to assist you with. This is an issue where these highlights are pretty well clipped out in camera. So you can see as I increase my max input, more of I'm reaching higher into the image for image. And you can see, like, if I tell it 300 nits, well, it turns out there actually is nothing that gets that bright in the source image. So I'm just bringing in empty buffer space, if that makes sense. And you can also see in the waveform that as opposed to recovering more of a sort of recovering more shape, like if you look, if I go below 100 nits and I start to walk my max input down, you can see I'm actually recovering contoured signal up to a certain point. And then somewhere around here, there's no contoured signal being recovered. I've just got a flat sort of shelf at the top of the signal. Does that make sense? Can you guys see my, okay, good. I always forget that my dumb face is threatening the visibility of my scopes. So again, this is maybe not the perfect image, but it's also a pretty good example of the type of image that you'll be working with in Rec 709. And this is why I generally will input map Rec 709 material using a color space transform, even if I were working in ACES, because I'm sensibly moving into the ACES CCT working space by using these settings like so. And I can now just kind of like sweep and see, like, okay, how far do I need to reach in order to get all the values in the source image? And it turns out in this case, I really don't need to go above 100. And then the other thing that we haven't looked at yet is I can also play around with my max output. I used to think like, oh, well, of course, I want all things to have all dynamic range at all times. But the reality is for Rec 709, especially like for archival, this comes up a lot in nonfiction HDR shows. I think I mentioned an example of this last week where it's like, all right, we've got this beautiful like Alexa ACAM interview footage of the subject, of the hero of the story. And then we've got archival video of them, putting on a concert in the 90s, or, like blowing out their birthday candles in the 80s or whatever. And surprisingly, that material wasn't shot on an Alexa, it's in SDR. So you can try to stretch that material out so that you're getting the same dynamic range in your end results as with your A camera. Or you can do what I do far more commonly, which is to say, well, if I can get to 350 from 100, that's pretty darn good. I mean, look at, like, I just went from 350 to 10,000. Look at how much my waveform changed. It doesn't scale in the way you would expect, first of all, okay? But that's something else to play with that I like to play with. I don't like the assumption that I want to take the full breadth of my incoming dynamic range and max it out, stretch it all the way out to fully fill the container. I generally am going to want to sort of hand tune this and say, hey, for this show, for archival, for SDR archival, if I can get a little bit of extra ping by stretching things out to 250, 300, 350 nits, that's the sweet spot. That's great. I don't really want to see, like, these highlights, they're not the richest highlights in the world. They're not the most textured. I don't really want to see those screaming at 1,000 nits or whatever I'm mastering to. Does that make sense? So you can kind of control both ends of the equation by using a color space transform. And this would be my preference. Again, even within ACES, I would play with that. A couple other things that you could look at just within here. This inverse OOTF, should I turn it off or on? You should do whatever looks better, because you're kind of in the realm of feel when you're mapping a display image back to a scene state. And you could also play around with some different gamma settings. 2.2 can work, 709A can work. It just depends on what exact flavor of Rec 709 you're kind of dealing with. So there's a little bit of feel and subjectivity that's built into this exercise as well. Again, all of which you have the ability to play with in a color space transform, and you don't have any of this in an ACES transform. You can select Rec 709 or sRGB, and that's it. So I hope that's helpful.
Okay, a question from Borja Campillo. Can you work in ACES with cameras that are not included in the panel?
Yes, good question. So this is a question about working with cameras that don't have an IDT preset within ACES. So yes, you absolutely can. And actually that kind of connects nicely to what we were just talking about. The way I would do that is probably with a color space transform. If I can find a color space transform, because you'll notice there are some cameras and color spaces that are supported and listed in the color space transform that are not supported in ACES CCT. So without knowing exactly what that would be in your case, if you find that that's the case and a color space that you need to input map is here but not in the ACES transform, you could do a variation of what we just did. Let's say that, DJI gamut, this may actually not be supported. I think this could be a good example. Well, now I'm just curious. Is DJI included in here? Nope. So that would be a good example. Maybe you got some DJI stuff that is dgamut dlog that you want to bring into ACES. Here's how you do it. This is completely sensible. It's tough to say, like, the question that I always get when I demoed this for people is like, well, yeah, but is that correct? It's like, well, it depends on what you mean by correct. Like, no, it's not supported. Like, there is no IDT for dgamut dlog in ACES. So in that sense, it is not correct because ACES didn't make this transform. However, ACES didn't invent some novel way of transforming color spaces. They're doing it the same way the color space transform is, by using tone curves and matrices. So correct is sort of a loaded term, but valid? Absolutely. This is just using sound color science to get into the metric defined by ACES, which is publicly available. It's not like it's a black box. So this would be an example of how I would do that here. You're generally going to want to leave your white point adaptation on in the case of most inputs, because most input spaces are going to be in D65, meaning the normal white point for our displays, where ACES has a white point that is essentially D60. And when you check this off, you can basically account for that in the transform. So this would be my first line of defense in how I would go about that. Now, you actually can go geekier than that as well. And there's I'm actually going to be sharing some resources along these lines in the coming months where you can build your own IDT. You can even submit it to the Academy if you want to, but you can build using a DCTL or by generating a LUT. You can build your own IDT for an unsupported color space. That's something that I've done a ton for myself and for private clients, and something I'm actually going to do for you guys in the coming months for a couple of color spaces that I feel like come up all the time, both in Resolve Color Management and ACES, that were like, gosh, I need a transform for that. And there is none. There's a couple of those that I'm going to try to cook up for you guys and provide free of charge. So you can look forward to that. That's kind of like the far end of the rainbow. That obviously requires some specialized skill and expertise. But oftentimes you'll find that what you're looking for may not be in the ACES transform, but it is in the color space transform.
Okay, a question from Jim Robinson. If you were selling ACES to someone, what are the best benefits to using ACES over any other color management system?
Adoption. ACES is the most broadly supported, most broadly adopted color management framework. So if you're talking about any kind of collaboration or interaction between vendors, or needing to not just operate as an island, but to interact and collaborate with others, ACES is something that is by far the most broadly supported because it's been around for the longest. So in some ways, I do feel like the burden of proof is kind of on other systems beyond ACES, because ACES has been around the longer. So if it can do everything, then that should probably be our default, because like, as any of you guys know who've hung out here on the channel with me, taken the time to educate yourselves on color management, it's freaking overwhelming at first. And like, I always try to remember this because I spend so much time fixating on these things. Most people, even most professionals, they just want to do their job. They do not want to take a 3-day detour to learn ACES or find out the hard way how something works because they screw up a job and now they know ACES, but they had to pay the price of, an unhappy client or something like that. Most people are not interested, and in many cases unwilling to learn that. So if using ACES makes them feel a little warmer and fuzzier, that makes it easier on a vendor, easier on a post supervisor that you're working with on behalf of your client, there's really something compelling to that, because if people are confused or frustrated about a color management framework, it doesn't matter how good it is. That always frustrates me, but that's the reality. So that's would be my big pitch for ACES. It's been around the longest. It has got the broadest adoption, the broadest support, and I'm excited to see it keep continuing to get better so that it really has legs as the de facto color management framework within the motion imaging industry. I would love to see it get to that place. I don't think it's there today. I think ACES 2.0 will represent a huge stride in that direction. But that would be kind of my pitch for why ACES and its core value prop. And we can do one more.
Okay, a question from Chris Lacayo. Is there a reason why ACES Transform doesn't let you output DaVinci Wide Gamut even in 1.3? What would that be appropriate using CSTs?
Yeah, so the question is, is there a reason why ACES and why ACES Transform doesn't speak DaVinci Wide Gamut? I would imagine, it's probably to do a little bit with both parties being the Academy and Blackmagic Design. But the way that works, the way you get support implemented for a particular color space in ACES is you submit it to the Academy and they review and approve it, right? It would not surprise me, I have no idea, but it would not surprise me to learn that Blackmagic did not submit DaVinci Wide Gamut. Furthermore, it would not surprise me if Blackmagic did submit DaVinci Wide Gamut and ACES were to say, we are not in the business of supporting proprietary color space transforms that are really designed for a particular platform, as opposed to something that can be agnostic and used in Resolve or Baselight or whatever color grading system you might be using. That's a bunch of wild guesses, but that would be my reasoning behind why you probably will never see DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate listed within the ACES transform under the menuing. But in terms of getting in and out of ACES and going in between DaVinci Wide Gamut and ACES, the question is, can we move between those using color space transforms? Would that be sound? Heck yeah, it would be. Here's how you would do it in one direction, and you could just flip these to go the other way. So if you want to take a DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate image, move it into ACES CCT, you could do it like that, and you could flip these around and do the exact opposite. And that's all fair play. That's all going to work. Only thing to note is DaVinci Wide Gamut, much larger than ACES AP1. So I'll show you guys one more kind of flourish to round us out for today, really what's going to be needed here, depending on the image, is some gamut compression, right? Because if I have an image that really hits the walls, really like uses the room, so to speak, of DaVinci Wide Gamut, there's going to be clipping and artifacting problems in AP1, more than likely. So what I really would like to use is the ACES gamut compression scheme to deal with those values, right? But I can't because I'm not using an ACES transform. Here's what we can do. I am now in ACES AP1, ACES CCT, right? So what if I do an ACES transform from ACES CCT to ACES CCT? Really boring transform, right? But just by doing that, I'm not actually moving anything, you can see. But if I now flip on the gamut compression, this image is a terrible example, but this would actually work. Like if I were to go to this image, this is going to be kind of confusing. So bear with me. I'm going to color space transform from my Airy space into DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. Okay. Not Canon Cinema Gamut. That's not right. So we're going to do something like this. So now my image is in DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate. I'm now going to use this handy dandy gizmo that we just built over here. So I'm starting with DaVinci Wide Gamut Intermediate, going to ACES AP1, ACES CCT, and then gamut compressing using an ACES transform that has a null transform from one to the other. Now, if I turn this off, I've got that same pesky cyan tearing. And by turning this on, I just wanted to prove to you guys that that actually works to go once you're in ACES CCT to apply this gamut compressor here. So this is something that once you're in ACES, you can use as a dedicated node of like, hey, I just want to apply some gamut compression at this point in the chain without moving color spaces. You can totally do that using a setup like this. All right, guys. That was a really good session. I feel like I was kind of long-winded on those things, but most of these talking points and questions that we covered today just bear longer explanation and discussion. So I hope you got something out of this. I hope you enjoyed sort of revisiting ACES and talking about it. And I'm going to take 2 minutes, show you guys one more thing. Can I have 2 minutes of your time, everybody? I wanted to show you guys the ACES 2.0 transform. So let's just go back to a normal, simple pipeline, okay? Arealog C3, ACES CCT, gamut compression on. Now I'm going to go over here, ACES CCT to Rec 709. Now, this is another link that I can dig up for you guys and post to my community page. But I've got things set up because I downloaded my candidate transforms. I can actually, under my output transform, I can look here at the bottom. You guys might have seen these earlier. Here are my ACES 2 candidates. These are publicly available. I've been loving ACES 2 Candidate C. It just has a different character. I mean, let's like compare one to the other. So here is regular ACES 709. Let's do it on a sort of more like normal image like this one. So here's ACES to 709. And there's my Candidate 2. You can see that's a very different rendering, right? Much less hot in the highlights, kind of a more conservative contrast level overall. So this is kind of what's around the bend. This is at least one of the candidates that's around the bend for the ACES 2 transform. I'm excited about it. Also because I'm a color scientist and a geek, some of the underlying math and schemes that are being used to arrive at this image, I've gotten the chance to explore and look through, and I really like what they're doing in there. And I know from having looked at it that it's going to support a really wide variety of images and get more consistently pleasing results with less artifacts and less, like sort of clipping and compression, or not compression, just clipping. So it's something that I'm pretty excited about. I don't know which of these candidates is going to be arrived at or whether these are the final, but it all makes me hopeful for ACES 2.0 that they're at least reconsidering that output link in the chain from a completely film agnostic point of view, because film print emulation, as much as I like it, that should not be part of a core output transform. That should be something that you incorporate to taste within a more neutral color management framework, if that makes sense. So I'll try to find a link for this GitHub posting for you guys as well. It's pretty DIY and hacky right now to get what I'm showing you right now in place. It's not that easy, but if you want to, then you can follow the instructions on the GitHub and give it a try for yourself. that was an hour really well spent, guys. I'm glad we got to revisit ACES. There's lots to like about ACES. There's lots of good reason to pay attention to ACES and to its continued growth and adoption, because it really stands the best chance of continuing to see broad support across our entire industry for color management. And I'll put it to you this way in closing. ACES color management is like a world better than no color management. If we can just get our industry bought in on ACES and adopting it, and ACES is continuing to improve, there's a lot of good stuff to be said about that. So I think it bears our paying attention as it continues to evolve, because it is so broadly adopted, and we should all have a stake in seeing proper color management, proper image pipeline more broadly supported and implemented throughout our industry. So thanks for hanging out with me, guys. Thanks for making it an earlier morning with me. And if you're not sick of me yet, join me in about an hour for my Intro to DCTL webinar that I'm going to be doing with Blackmagic Design. Totally free. We've left a link in the chat, hopefully now, Rafa. Is that right?
Yeah.
All right.
I'm doing it.
Okay, good deal. So I will see you guys there. If you are coming over from here and you decide to join me there, give me a shout. Let me know in there, and I'll look for y'all as well. Thanks as always, guys. Awesome spending Friday morning with you. Hope you guys have an awesome weekend, an awesome week, and we'll see you for grade school next week. Take care.